What is up, you guys? Ryan Brewer back here, the host of Michael Myers Reacts, and today I want to talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. I wanted to do something a little different. I've been talking about the Halloween franchise a lot lately. Not that I'm going to stop talking about the Halloween franchise, because after this I'm going to continue talking about the Halloween franchise, but I wanted to do something a little different because I didn't want to overdo it with the Halloween content, and I really wanted to talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street. But before we talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street, I do want to say that 89% of my watch time are from non-subscribers. So if you guys are horror fans and Halloween fans, definitely hit that subscribe button. That would be much appreciated. So here we are talking about A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984, one of the best horror movies ever made. But before we get into actually talking about the movie, I want to talk about Wes Craven as a director. Now, Wes Craven is personally one of my favorite directors of all time. He isn't my favorite director of all time. That definitely goes to John Carpenter. But Wes Craven is in my top 3. And if you're a horror fan, you definitely know the name Wes Craven. If you don't, then why? Wes Craven is such a genius. He gave us some very unique horror films, and this is one of them. I think A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of the most unique horror films ever made. And not only was Wes Craven a director, he was also a writer, a really good writer, actually. Usually when you think of Wes Craven, you think of Kevin Williamson because of the Scream franchise. But, you know, Wes was a writer as well, and he was a very good writer. And Wes Craven gave us some of the best horror movie titles of all time, A Nightmare on Elm Street being one of them, The Hills Have Eyes, The Last House on the Left, The People Under the Stairs. Do I have to continue? I mean, this man was such a genius that just by his movie titles, like only a genius can come up with those. Okay, enough of me talking about how great Wes Craven is. I think you guys understand it. But A Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite Wes Craven movie of all time. I know people will disagree with me. They'll say Scream or whatever else. I mean, Scream is definitely my second favorite Wes Craven movie of all time, but A Nightmare on Elm Street to me is his best written and directed movie. Now, I know I say this is his best directed movie. I know technology got better after this. You know, he had movies after A Nightmare on Elm Street and technology got a lot better. But just think of Tina's death alone in this movie. I mean, that is such an incredible kill and shot very well. You know, the reason why A Nightmare on Elm Street is perfect to me is because it's a very unique horror film. There's not a lot of horror films like this. Now, I'm sure it's had its copycats over the years, but obviously none of them can beat A Nightmare on Elm Street. Even to this day, I think A Nightmare on Elm Street is still one of still one of the most unique horror films ever made, which is a great thing. I think it just really goes to show how creative and how much of a genius Wes Craven was. Why can I not speak? And of course, he came up with one of the best horror icons of all time, Freddy Krueger. I mean, you know, he is my second favorite horror icon after Michael Myers. Like, if the Halloween franchise didn't exist, the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise would be my number 1. It would be Freddy Krueger Reacts. Okay, I probably wouldn't call it Freddy Krueger Reacts, but you get what I'm saying here. I just love the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. I love the original movie. That movie, to me, to this day, is still absolutely terrifying. With Tina in the hallway, you know, Nancy's in the school, in the classroom, and she's saying, Nancy. It's just so creepy. It still gets under my skin. And I mean, of course, that's a point of a horror movie. If you're not scared or creeped out, then it's not really doing its job. And Nightmare on Elm Street definitely does its job well. It is a very scary horror movie even to this day. Now, of course, there's people who aren't going to be scared of this movie, and I'm not necessarily scared of the movie, but the scare factor is definitely still there. There are things in that movie that make me go, wow. And that hallway scene with Tina in the body bag getting dragged, of course we don't see anything because Freddy's doing it, but then again, he is a dream demon, and you know, you don't necessarily have to see him. You know what I mean? That whole scene to this day, I think, is still chilling. And I feel like what I'm about to say is actually going to be a very unpopular opinion. So the cast for A Nightmare on Elm Street was great, of course, but I really want to talk about Robert Englin as Freddy Krueger in this, because now Robert Englin did great in all the movies as Freddy Krueger. Of course, he didn't play Freddy Krueger in the 2010 remake, but him in this movie, in the first movie, is probably my favorite version of Freddy. And you know, that can change. I love him in New Nightmare. I love him in Part 3. I love him in the second movie. I think he actually looks better in the second movie, but this one, to me, Freddy is his scariest. And I know a lot of people's going to say Part 2, and I don't disagree with that. I do think Freddy Krueger is very scary in Part 2. I do think the makeup looks better in Part 2, but something about Freddy in this first movie is just more scary to me. I don't know why. Maybe it's because Freddy doesn't have as much lines in this movie, because once we get to part 2 and so on, he gets more of the one-liners and he's saying a lot more. In this first movie, he says things, of course. He has those one-liners. He's still kind of jokey in this movie, but he just doesn't talk a lot. And those of you who have been watching my channel for a long time know that I'm a huge Robert Englin fan. I really look up to that guy. He's an inspiration for what I do in everything. I'm a huge Robert Englin fan, and I just love his performance in this first movie. I love him in all the movies, even Freddy's Dead. I know Freddy's Dead is garbage, but, Robert Englin as Freddy Krueger is the strong point of Freddy's Dead. But we're not here talking about Freddy's Dead, but I just love Robert Englin, and I'm glad that he is Freddy Krueger. I'm going to kind of go off topic here for a minute, but I want to talk about how Freddy Krueger? I want to talk about Robert Englin isn't the only guy who can portray Freddy Krueger. Now, of course, going forward, I would love Robert to come back, but at this point, I think we can all sit here and say that, he's most likely never going to play Freddy again. And as a Nightmare on Elm Street fan, I want to see the character of Freddy Krueger continue. There's definitely somebody out there who can play Freddy Krueger, and I also think that's how Wes would have wanted it. I feel like Wes would have wanted the character of Freddy Krueger to continue on. Also, Robert Englin knows that there's other people out there who could portray Freddy Krueger, and as a Nightmare on Elm Street fan, I know that there's someone out there who could portray Freddy Krueger, and someone who could make Wes and Robert Englin proud. But yeah, everything about A Nightmare on Elm Street is perfect. I mean, I really wouldn't change anything about it. At the time, it was very unique, and even now it's very unique. And Freddy Krueger has become an icon, of course, and I love that he's a unique killer. I mean, this is before Chucky. We all know that Chucky has his one-liners and stuff like that, which I would say was very much inspired by Freddy Krueger, because Freddy Krueger came first. And Freddy's one-liners are great, and I know people are like, oh, well, he gets less serious as the series goes on. Freddy had one-liners in the first movie as well, and he was kind of jokey, like when Tina takes his face off and you can see a skeleton, and this is God, and he's just doing all kinds of jokes in this first movie. Of course, he got more jokey as the series go on, but he was always kind of like that since the beginning. Now, of course, I agree that it got a little too much as the series went on, but in this one, it's just right. You know what I mean? They don't do it too much in this movie. Actually, they really don't do it at all. I mean, it's there, but it's really not there. This is more of a serious movie than a horror comedy. There's just a little bit of comedy thrown in, if I can speak, but other than that, this is a very serious horror movie. And Freddy Krueger having the iconic glove that we all know and love today is another reason why this movie is perfect. I mean, not only is A Nightmare on Elm Street a perfect film, it created a perfect horror icon. Freddy Krueger is flawless almost, other than, of course, the bad sequels that we got later on. But just thinking about the character of Freddy Krueger as this dream demon that uses this glove with... I cannot speak tonight. But him using this glove with knives on it is iconic. It's one of the coolest weapons in horror history, I would say. And it's just... all came from the mind of Wes Craven. I mean, I just can't process how much of a genius Wes Craven really was. And not only was A Nightmare on Elm Street a unique horror movie, and not only was Freddy Krueger a unique horror icon, we had a unique final girl. Nancy fights Freddy Krueger. I mean, at this point, we really didn't have a final girl who fought back. Laurie didn't do it, and I can't think of any other horror film where the female fought back, where the final girl fought back, and Nancy did that, and that's one reason why I love Nancy. She's one of my favorite final girls of all time, and it's just, everything about this is unique. And ultimately, that's why this movie is perfect to me. It's a very, very unique horror film. It's still one of the most unique, even today. It's scary, and it's perfect. I can't really say much more about this movie. It's such a good movie. So if you guys want me to continue with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and of course the Halloween franchise, I'm still doing that. If you guys want me to talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, please let me know in the comment section down below. If you guys did enjoy this video, please leave a like and subscribe. That would be much appreciated, and I will see you guys on the next video.